Welcome to our first panel of the film festival. I'm Ann Barhill, a professor of medical ethics, and our panelists here are Mina Mazaj and Samir Nurmohamed of the Wharton School, and sorry, Mita's from the School of Arts and Sciences. So we're going to have a conversation for a little bit, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. Mina, so I thought maybe we'd start with you, and I'm just interested in your reactions as a film scholar, just your sort of general reactions to the film and how you think about it as a film.
Yes. So it's curious, when my first year that I started teaching, it was a composition class, and we had to teach the Stanford Prison Experiment. So, you know, it's we all know that it's one of the most famous, widely debated, generally known experiments in the history of psychology, but it's also one that's had several previous depictions in popular culture. So there are many TV shows that have based their episodes on the Stanford Prison Experiment. There's a fringe play. There's, I think, even a band by the name of the Stanford Prison Experiment.
Wow.
There was a documentary made on the film called The Quiet Rage. A German fiction drama, I think, called Das Experiment, 2001, and then the American remake in 2010. So I was curious what this film is bringing to the table that is different, right? That makes us talk about and see this experiment in a new light. Yeah. And I have to say I was pleasantly surprised. I think it's not so much the meticulous recreation of the experiment or the revealing what we don't know yet, right? Which is something that a documentary would do. So I don't think it's that the film draws its greatest strength from, even though it does that very meticulously. But how, as Lance pointed out, how the film uses the experiment and uses the dilemmas of the experiment in terms of the cinematic experience. Yeah. So it, after throwing us straight into the experiment itself without introducing the characters, without giving us either the context or anything about the characters and their background, the director, Alvarez, I think rather brilliantly depicts the claustrophobic intensity and the visceral aspect of the experiment. So I don't think the film is so much about who is who or what exactly the procedure is, what the details of the experiment are, which is there meticulously represented, but it's more about how it feels, where the experience of the experiment blends with the experience of watching the film. So we have this drab, monochromatic cinematography that dehumanizes, de-individualizes the characters. You probably noticed the prevalent use of close-ups and very tight framing that has a lot of motion in it, but it's like imprisoned motion where the movement is not so much liberating movement, but it has to do with the intensity of the energy and the atmosphere that's building up. The soundtrack is very, very intense, ominous. So there's an excellent sound design where every loud crack of the guard stick, I think, registers with a very visceral force. And then we have this prolongation of time. I don't know how you felt, but I felt like we got pretty quickly to day one, and then it felt like a month before day two appeared. And finally, and I think most importantly, how Alvarez brings the very cinematic apparatus into the significance of the experiment itself. So it's not only that everybody, including us, are very aware that the whole thing is, framed within the surveillance apparatus that everybody's watching, and either watching or being watched. But I think in regard to that, it's also very important that the characters and their behavior that we're seeing, we don't quite know whether their behavior has to do with their individual psychology or whether it's just a reenactment of popular media representation. So the John Wayne and the Cool Hand Luke film, the famous prison movie that they're referring to, and even in the end, he's saying, well, I'm just enacting, the images or reenacting the images that I have seen on screen. The kind of sick way in which Zimbardo himself turns from a psychology into a sick voyeur who cannot detach himself from the increasingly abject images that he's watching.
Like we see at the end where it's almost like he literally cannot tear himself away from the screen. He starts watching in horror, his own experiment in horror, and can't really tear himself away.
Exactly, and we see his facial muscles twitching, and he almost becomes like a perfect representation of a cinephile who, we're watching, but we can't stop watching, and he keeps saying, we have to, let's see where it goes. Let's not stop the story. Let's not, let's continue the narrative. Let's see how it gets resolved. You can't stop the movie halfway.
Right.
One thing that I loved about what you just said too was just how the film is very much a microcosm of what the experiment was like, but also what was really going on in the field of social psychology at the time. So to this point, personality psychology was just really, really popular. And it was the dominant view in psychology. And then you had the Milgram experiment.
And what's personality psychology?
And personality psychology emphasizes the person, and the person is the reason why things happen. So, before you had the Stanley Milgram experiments, which you're going to see the movie on Thursday, it was very much the case that people thought, oh, you had to be a certain type of person to do these types of things, to do evil things. And Milgram was one of the first to come along and really show that, hey, it's actually the power of the situation, which plays a really prevalent role. And after that, there started to become more of a movement. And I think Zimbardo himself, very much, I remember reading an interview, and he said actually that he saw his experiment as a bookend to the Milgram experiments. He said it was taking it to another level in the fact that it wasn't just this one-time short experiment. If you think about the Milgram experiment, it's much shorter. It's about an hour, whereas this was supposed to be elongated over a period of 2 weeks.
And just to fill people, the Milgram experiment was an experiment where people were asked to apply what they thought were real electric shocks to someone who was in another room, and they could hear the person protesting, moaning, but many people continued to apply the shocks.
Exactly, and it's really the Milgram experiments and Zimbardo and others who followed, and many people who followed in that tradition, who really brought out the sense that anybody could fall victim to this, anybody could succumb to this situation. And I thought it was just really interesting how you said, well, they jumped right into the situation. They didn't introduce the characters. They didn't introduce the people, and that very much plays out in the same way in terms of what happened in the field.